Hi, it's Nicole from A Day of Small Things. I plan to do a few deep dive videos on The Merchant of Venice today and in the following weeks. In A Midsummer Night's Dream and Hamlet, for example, there is a play within the play. In Merchant, there are stories within the story. The tales Shylock tells give insights into his character and also offer glimpses into Shakespeare's society. Shylock first appears in Act 1, Scene 3. Bassanio lays out the terms of the deal: 3,000 ducats for 3 months, Antonio bound. As soon as Antonio joins them, Shylock tells us why he hates Antonio: religion and money. How like a fawning publican he looks. I hate him for he is a Christian, but more for that in low simplicity he lends out money gratis and brings down the rate of usance here with us in Venice. If I can catch him once upon the hip, I will feed fat the ancient grudge I bear him. He hates our sacred nation, and he rails, even there where merchants most do congregate, on me, my bargains, and my well-worn thrift, which he calls interest. Cursed be my tribe, if I forgive him. Shylock hates Antonio, firstly because he himself is a Jew, and Antonio is a Christian who hates our sacred nation. There's the conflict of religion. Secondly, Antonio lends out money freely. A wealthy merchant who gives loans without charging interest reduces the overall rate of interest in the city's market. As a result, Shylock cannot make as much money from his own money-lending business. Thirdly, according to Shylock, Antonio complains and criticizes publicly and abusively his money-lending practice. Shylock calls it bargains and well-worn thrift. Antonio calls it interest. Interest here has a negative connotation, meaning usury, which Oxford English Dictionary defines as the fact or practice of lending money at interest, especially in later use, the practice of charging, taking, or contracting to receive excessive or illegal rates of interest for money on loan. Shylock hates Antonio and declares that if he can catch him once upon the hip, he will feed fat the ancient grudge, meaning that if he ever catches Antonio at a disadvantage, he will take full advantage of the opportunity for revenge. Cursed be my tribe if I forgive him. So, however complex and sympathetic the character becomes later on, Shylock begins to play with a deep-rooted hatred and a desire for deadly revenge against Antonio from the very start. So what is the tale that Shylock tells here? It's a subtle one compared to some of the ones I'll unpack in the following weeks. Do you notice that I missed out one line? The first thing that Shylock says when Antonio comes into the scene. Shylock says, "How like a fawning publican he looks." Shylock compares Antonio to a publican, but what does a publican look? Who is a publican? Let me read you something and see if it helps. And after these things he went forth, and saw a publican named Levi, sitting at the receipt of custom. And he said unto him, Follow me. And he left all, rose up, and followed him. And Levi made him a great feast in his own house. And there was a great company of publicans and of others that sat down with them. But their scribes and Pharisees murmured against his disciples, saying, Why do ye eat and drink with publicans and sinners? Another one. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee and the other a publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself: God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice in a week, I give tithe of all that I possess. And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much as his eyes unto heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. These two passages are taken from King James Bible version of Luke's Gospel. Maybe you grew up with it and it's very familiar, but for me, this is the first time I learned that publican means tax collector. Oxford English Dictionary defines publican as a person who farms the public taxes, a tax gatherer, especially any of those in Judea and Galilee in the New Testament period, who were generally regarded as traitorous and impious on account of their service of Rome and their extortion. They collect money from their fellow Jews for the Roman occupier in New Testament time and get rich themselves by fleecing their own people. Tax collectors are despised by the Jews and treated with contempt. You can sense that even in the two passages I just read from Luke's Gospel. So, what does Shylock mean when he says how like a fawning publican he looks? To a 16th century audience who is familiar with the New Testament stories about the publicans. He compares Antonio to a tax collector. He hates him as a Jew hates a tax collector. But everything else after that is not very straightforward. For example, tax collectors, though hated, are Jews themselves. By calling Antonio a tax collector, he gives Antonio a Jewish identity. Why does Shylock reduce the distance between Antonio and himself? Another thing, tax collectors are closely associated with dealing in money, so it is understandable that Shylock's mind turns to tax collection when he thinks about taking interest. However, Antonio does not charge interest or profit from lending. He does not collect anything. It is Shylock, not Antonio, who grows rich by charging high interest through money lending. Shylock is a lot more like a tax collector than Antonio. Is Shylock mixing the two up? Another curious thing is, by labeling Antonio as a tax collector, Shylock puts himself in the category of the Pharisees. If you are familiar with the gospel stories, you will know that tax collectors and sinners are almost always mentioned in contrast to the Pharisees, as in the two accounts I read just now. Jesus has a dinner party with tax collectors. It is the Pharisees who criticize him. Jesus' parables similarly use tax collectors and Pharisees as foils to highlight moral contrast. A tax collector goes to the temple to pray. It is a Pharisee who despises and judges him. Pharisees are not nice people. They are famous for being self-righteous and hard-hearted. Mark's Gospel has 16 chapters. The Pharisees decide to kill Jesus as early as the beginning of chapter 3. In a lot of the Gospel narratives, they are the antagonists. The last thing I want to draw your attention to is the word fawning. Shylock says Antonio looks like a fawning publican. The tax collectors probably fawn upon the Roman rulers. Who does Antonio fawn upon? I can't think of anyone in particular. Fawn means to affect a servile fondness, to court favor or notice by an abject demeanor. It means it needs more than one person to show a servile characteristic, because one person needs to fawn on the other. It's not clear where this scene is set exactly, except it's in Venice. To make sense of Shylock's line, I imagine the scene is set in a busy marketplace where Shylock can watch Antonio move through the crowd towards them. As he walks, people would stop to shake his hand and greet him warmly, either because of the financial help he has given them in the past, or simply because Antonio is a man of good reputation in the city. It is when Antonio returns the greeting in humble modesty, Shylock can describe him as fawning. Shylock sees his modesty as despicably servile. In this speech, Shylock expresses his resentment by complaining about and criticizing Antonio. He reviews as much about Shylock as he does about Antonio. When he says Antonio does business in low simplicity, he's judging Antonio to be disgraceful and ignorant as a merchant. By portraying Antonio as ignorant, Shylock casts himself as morally and professionally superior, reinforcing his own sense of self-righteousness. We'll continue with another story next time to see how Shylock justifies his craftiness and hear other tales that Shylock tells. That's all for today. Thank you for watching. I will see you in my next one.